Glad to have you back. You're watching Business Morning, the midweek edition of the program on Channels Television. Now, removing impediments to the movement of goods and people around Africa is critical for economies to develop. Now, Africa, including Nigeria, must address issues such as under-industrialization, poor infrastructure, and, of course, power. Now, because Africa's economies are mostly small, regional collaboration is needed to justify the high cost of infrastructure spending to create regional value chains and to allow skills to move across borders. Now, at a session on the future of trade at the just concluded World Economic Forum on Africa, I beg your pardon, meeting in Cape Town, South Africa, the participants highlighted the fact that just about 12% of African countries' total trade is with each other, and the continent only accounts for about 3% of value addition in global trade. Now, I had a chat with Uche Oji, the managing director, Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority. He commented on these issues. He also spoke about what should be done to boost Nigeria's industrialization plans. Various sessions have focused on issues that affect Africa, issues that it seems everybody just keeps talking about. And one of the sessions that I actually sat in on what's next for Africa's frontier markets, it seemed as if the panelists were talking more about implementation and action and less about talk.
Sure. But I think the good news about the whole Africa Renaissance story is we've had an opportunity to talk through some of the issues, and we're now in the phase of implementing some of the solutions. And we might be in this phase for a very long time because, frankly, the truth is there are so many, in my opinion, still fundamental issues that need to be sorted in Africa. Number one, for example, is Intra-African Trade. It's significantly lower. What you find is mostly, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, people export to Europe and then import. So there's a lot more bilateral trade between African countries and European countries, but less so across African countries. And that might just be a reflection of the fact that we are still not very industrialized, but the reality is that I think that is something we need to work on. Industrializing Africa will improve intra-Africa trade. Why not do your cocoa processing in Nigeria instead of exporting it from Ghana to Switzerland and then back to Nigeria? So things like that are things, in my opinion, that will have to be worked on. The second thing, in my opinion, that needs to be worked on is intra-Africa travel. From Abuja to Cape Town, you need 2 stops. That doesn't make any sense. This is the 2 capitals of the top number 1 and number 2 economies in Africa. So intra-Africa travel, obviously travel will follow trade and trade will follow capital. So over time, my sense is that you're going to find more and more of implementation at the level of industrialization, at the level of improvement of intra-Africa travel, and then we might actually find out that we can independently grow our own economy, without significant much external interference.
Now, one of the sessions focused on industrializing Africa, and for Nigeria in particular, it's a very interesting time, especially since we have a new government. Now, a lot of people are thinking, do we have strategies, do we have policies in place that are actually going to encourage that industrialization that we're looking for?
I think if you go back, the history of Nigeria, as far back as the 70s, there's always been an industrialization policy. There's been an infrastructure master plan. There's always something. And the reality is that the vastness of Nigeria sometimes makes these things a little bit challenging to implement as quickly as people would like. What I expect to see, frankly, is that there isn't much by way of new thinking. It's actually more about implementing everything we know. You don't need a rocket scientist to tell you that if you improve electricity supply, you will naturally grow small and medium-scale enterprises. There are industries that are dead in Nigeria. Welding, for example. When I was growing up in Nigeria, every other stop I saw welders working, fabricating metals and stuff like that. Welding requires electricity. That's just basic. That industry and that skill set is gone. And you can also find it in steel. We haven't got much steel manufactured in Nigeria. You cannot build infrastructure without steel. It's as simple and as basic as that. So, luckily for us now, we've actually had an industrialist in Nigeria build a cement factory. Those are the 2 most important things for you to build proper infrastructure: steel and cement. It's simple. So cement, luckily, we have now, and we need to have still a lot more capacity. But steel is basic. So you fix that, you fix electricity, then you start to talk about much more fundamental industrialization. So there's a lot to be done. I'm very, very optimistic. I'm very expectant. The good news is that these discussions have gone to a slightly more advanced level. We're now talking about how do we fund it. We know what to do. 10 years ago, it was like, what do we do? Or maybe even 20 years ago. But now we're talking about how do we effectively fund these things. You've seen Nigerian banks step into the game They are much better capitalized now. They're helping with the power funding and all that. The reality is that I feel good about the future, and I think that we know what to do, and the good news is that we're having much more practical conversations about how do we get it done. My focus obviously on the financial side, and I think there are quite a few ideas that have come out of here that I think will be very useful.
Could you share one of those ideas with us? Because as the managing director of Nigeria's Sovereign Investment Authority, it is, quite interesting because there's actually a fund, that's supposed to be for infrastructure. So a lot of talk, and I know the last time we had a conversation, you actually talked about the fact that the NSIA was very giving some kind of funding to the construction of the second Niger Bridge. How far gone is that project?
So we are co-developing it. By the way, a bridge project of that size and scale, we're talking about the actual water crossing is 2 kilometers. But because it's in a marshy area, you're doing something that's deck on pile for another 10 kilometers. So it's quite expansive. Deck on pile is almost like building another bridge. So you're looking at something the length of almost 12 kilometers. So it's a big, and the reason is because the area is congested. You really can't put another bridge inside Onitsha because of the level of compensation alone will be enormous. So you have to skirt around it, and that is why the bridge is being designed that way. If you go past the area, people will tell you actually can see the new bridge coming up. A lot of piling work has been done, a lot of dredging work has been done. I can actually show you pictures to show that things are actually happening. The timeline is still to do a 4-year construction, but there are still many basic things that still need to get done in the meantime. But whilst we are on that, because that's a co-development project that's going to take 4 years, we've also funded a bond instrument for Seven Energy to help them build a pipeline to connect power plants in Calabar area. And I think that is something that we invested about $100 million in, and it's actually one of our flagship investments we made last year we're very proud about. There's more that we need to do. We haven't, frankly, touched a significant part of aspects of what we can do with infrastructure. Number one is that we were set up to also attract co-investors. Okay, and I've made this comment, I think last time you and I spoke. In the power area, we have a collaboration with a private equity company that will put in $2 for every $1 we put in. So that's the kind of thing we expect to do in NSIA, which is to attract co-investments. We have signed up many collaborations with various other funds, sovereign wealth funds, private equity funds, development banks. Last week, 2 weeks ago, my chairman and I signed an MOU with the Islamic Development Bank, who are willing to help fund some of these infrastructure programs. So it's not just so much about NSIA spending its own money, it's about NSIA mobilizing capital from other sources of capital, and we expect to do that. So this year, expect us to continue with the second Niger Bridge work, expect us to do something in power. I think we have taken our time to actually study the landscape. Initially, we couldn't do much on power because a lot had happened before NSIA got set up. The privatization program was in full swing. But watch this space. This year, you'll see us make an announcement in terms of power investment. We've also signed up 6 teaching hospitals and federal medical centers to do diagnostic centers and specialist clinics. We signed those late last year, and we look to start implementing some of them this year. We made some small investment in agriculture. That's an advanced program where, with a few major agro firms, I met them here as well, to actually make an investment in agriculture. So these are some of the things we're doing. We're trying to work within the areas we defined as the initial areas we want to work in, which are healthcare, motorways, agriculture, power, and real estate. So those are the rail. We are also working on rail. Actually, I spent the first 6 months of my time at NSIA looking across the entire rail landscape. The reality is that there's a lot of capital needed in rail. For us to have, if you look at South Africa, second largest economy in Africa, 15% of their freight is moved by rail. They have over 2,500 locomotives pulling freight. Nigeria, the largest economy, moves less than 0.1% of our freight by rail. There is a lot that's needed to be done. We actually have less than 30 locomotives, in Nigeria, against 2,500, almost 3,000 in South Africa. So the numbers are quite significant. So we know that. But you need a lot of capital to fix rail. We've looked at various studies. To have an effective rail network across the country will cost you no less than $30 billion. Right, so this is not chump change, right? However, we're not going to take on the entire thing. There are certain aspects of rail network that work can be done on very quickly. How about connecting an inland container terminal in Shagamu to Ido terminal, so we can pull things from Apapa Wharf straight there, so that we don't congest Apapa. These are things that people are talking about and working on. How about we do the same thing in Ajokuta? It's 40 kilometers to the next mines. in Ajokuta area. That bit we can also do, build a lot of sidings. So there are many aspects to it, but I think the overall investment required in rail will require the same level of effort made in power to bring in private sector participation. The government does not have the resources to do it. And we have to hurry up with some of this investment. So there's a lot I believe I'm expecting will come, as we transition to a new government that I think will help some of these investment areas.
Now, it's...
The short answer is that NSIA cannot do rail now because we have a small amount of money.
Oh, okay. We have a small amount of money. Well, we'll keep that in check. But then, everybody always says it's just talk. We want more action, we want more implementation, we need more strategies, we need more reforms in key sectors.
Sure.
Now, the summit, the meeting ends today.
Yes.
And everybody goes away. What are your strongest points that you're taking away from this meeting?
Okay, there are three things that I think, for me, have been major feedback coming out of this meeting. Number one, there is a lot more focus of Africans solving Africa's problems, and I think it may sound very blaze, but people are now looking for capital within Africa. People are looking for solution within Africa. Nobody is looking for housing solution from Spain. People are looking for housing solution from South Africa, where the cost of doing business is significantly lower, frankly, from my observation, than in Nigeria. So you are looking at Africans solving Africa's problems, and most of the interaction I've had here have been with people who are playing in Africa. I've had an interesting meeting a while ago with a young man who had just built a phenomenal trucking and logistics business in Congo, Brazzaville, and wants to come and do the same thing in Nigeria. So there's a lot of intra-Africas, we have the same situations. Roads are bad in Congo, they're bad in Nigeria. How do you maintain these things? How do you make sure you keep your trucks uptime and all that? Great conversations, So healthcare, the same level of conversation. We all have similar health issues across sub-Saharan Africa, and then there are people that have solutions that could be implemented. So I think the first thing is that we are more looking inwards for our solution now than looking outside. That, for me, is the first thing, and that also includes the capital market. The second thing is obviously the conversation now about creating an infrastructure solution, and I think the key thing here is it's all going to cost money, and there are interesting ways to think about it. One of the things that we are working on in NSIA is actually creating what we call a Nigeria Credit Enhancement Facility. This is something that provides enhancement that will help people invest in infrastructure. I talked about this last year. I mentioned it in your program last year when we spoke. We are actually at advanced stages, but obviously we need to get a lot more buy-in before we can implement something like that. It was obvious government doesn't have the capital to invest in these things, but how does government effectively use guarantees and create enhancement to bring private sector capital? That's the conversations we're having here as well. The third conversation, I think this is probably more important, is how do we develop human capital? Because at the end of the day, the most important resource you have is not natural resource. The most important resource is human resource. How do we get education to the levels that we can actually compete? Last time I checked some of the numbers, China graduates something close to like 1 million people in physical sciences. That's engineering, math, physics, those kind of stuff. And these are really highly trained people. How do we get our people to go to school, effectively make the secondary schools very, very effective, and translate that through the universities? Because look, you can build a fantastic piece of infrastructure, but if you haven't got people to run it, it's a waste. And then the final issue, obviously, along those lines is how do we create jobs? We have a very young population in Nigeria. If we do not create enough jobs, we have a problem. The president identified that in his inaugural speech, and I think this is something that I think is very important. So these are the things we're talking about here at Wealth, and for me, it's been quite enriching. And then finally, of course, it saves me the hassle of running around trying to meet my counterparties. It's easy to see them here, and it's been a very successful outing for us.
Uche Oji, the Managing Director of the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority, there in a chat with me, just on the sidelines of the just concluded World Economic Forum Africa meeting in Cape Town, South Africa. Now, the NSIA, that's just like a sneak peek, is actually, doing a lot of mobilizing of capital from the Islamic Development Bank to fund infrastructure projects across the country. Just like he mentioned, the NSI is actually collaborating with a couple of companies to build the second Niger bridge, and listening from conversation with him, it's actually work that is on the way, and we should be seeing results in a couple of months, maybe years. And from also the conversation, Africa, including Nigeria, should begin to look inwards for solutions with regards to challenges that we have. Of course, power is a major thing that everybody's been talking about. The 17th AEF is going on in Dubai, and that's what they're talking seriously about, how to power Africa. A session today is going to be focusing on how Buhari's administration should be looking at powering Nigeria and addressing some of the challenges that can be addressed when there's power, talking about creating more jobs, having better access for the critical sector, that's the small and medium enterprises, which we know that when they have power, creates an enormous amount of jobs. We're still going to be talking about what can be done to improve the economy. Now we'll be looking at the fixed income market. We're talking about regulations. And when we come back, a conversation that my colleague, business correspondent Tempo Ashajo, had with the director of legal and regulatory of the FMDQ is something you want to listen to. Stay with us.